The baker's compassion. The small village of Oak Hollow was known for its simplicity, nestled in the heart of a rolling green valley. The village was quiet, with narrow cobbled streets, rows of ivy-covered houses, and a single, large oak tree that stood proudly in the town square. It was a place where everyone knew everyone else, and the hum of life moved at a gentle pace. Among the village's many quaint businesses was the Cozy Crust, a bakery owned by a kind-hearted man named Henry. Henry was not wealthy by any means, but his bakery was famous throughout Oak Hollow for its delicious bread, cakes, and pastries. Henry had inherited the bakery from his father, who had inherited it from his own father before him. The Cozy Crust had been a cornerstone of the village for over 3 generations. The bakery sat on the corner of Maple Street, and every morning the aroma of freshly baked bread would drift out from the open windows, drawing villagers and travelers alike. Henry was a man of few words, but a heart full of warmth. He had a way of looking after the people in his village, whether it was offering a discounted loaf of bread to an elderly woman or slipping an extra pastry into a child's bag without them noticing. His kindness extended not only to people but also to animals, and he had a particular fondness for the little creatures that lived around the village. It was a chilly morning in early spring when the story of Henry's compassion began to unfold. As usual, Henry had woken up before dawn, his day starting long before the village stirred from sleep. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden light over the cobblestones as Henry stoked the fire in his oven and began preparing the dough for the day's bread. The bakery smelled of flour, yeast, and sugar, the warmth from the oven providing a stark contrast to the crispness of the air outside. As Henry kneaded the dough on his large wooden counter, he heard a soft rustling sound coming from the alleyway just behind his bakery. At first, he thought it might have been the wind, but as the rustling persisted, his curiosity got the better of him. He wiped his flour-covered hands on his apron and stepped outside. There, near the back door of the bakery, sitting huddled beside an overturned wooden crate, was a tiny rabbit. Its fur was brown and mottled, blending in almost perfectly with the muddy ground, and its ears drooped as it shivered in the cold. The rabbit was no larger than Henry's hand, and it looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Henry's heart softened instantly. He could see that the rabbit was in bad shape. It was thin, its fur matted and dirty, and its little body trembled with hunger and cold. The poor creature was clearly lost or abandoned, and Henry couldn't bear the thought of leaving it to fend for itself in the wild. "Well now," Henry said softly, crouching down to get a closer look at the little rabbit. "What are you doing out here all alone, little one?" The rabbit didn't move, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly as it stared up at Henry with frightened eyes. He could tell it was terrified, but also too weak to run away. Without thinking twice, Henry gently reached out his hand. The rabbit flinched at first, but when it realized Henry meant no harm, it stayed still, allowing him to scoop it up into his arms. "Don't worry," Henry murmured, cradling the rabbit close to his chest to warm it. "I've got you now. Let's get you out of the cold." With that, Henry carried the little rabbit back into the warmth of the bakery. He placed it on a soft, folded towel near the hearth, where the fire crackled gently. The rabbit didn't resist, too exhausted to do much more than lie there, its tiny eyes blinking slowly as it tried to take in its new surroundings. Henry hurried to prepare a small bowl of warm milk, placing it in front of the rabbit. At first, the little creature didn't move, still too frightened to eat. But after a few moments, it began to sniff the air, its nose twitching. Slowly, tentatively, the rabbit dipped its head and began to lap at the milk. Henry smiled as he watched the rabbit eat, relieved that it was beginning to trust him, if only a little. Over the next few days, the little rabbit grew stronger under Henry's care. He fed it scraps of vegetables from his kitchen and gave it fresh water and milk. He even set up a small corner in the back of the bakery, where the rabbit could have a bed made of soft rags and a bit of hay. It didn't take long for the rabbit to become a part of the daily rhythm of the Cozy Crust. Henry didn't know much about rabbits, but he could tell this one was special. It had a curious nature, always hopping around the bakery, sniffing at the bags of flour and peeking into the ovens when Henry wasn't looking. It wasn't long before the villagers began to notice the new addition to the bakery. Henry, what's this I hear about you taking in a rabbit? Mrs. Miller, an elderly woman who had been coming to the Cozy Crust for years, asked one morning as she came in for her usual loaf of rye bread. Henry smiled and motioned to the back of the bakery, where the little rabbit was curled up in its makeshift bed, nibbling on a carrot. He's been keeping me company these past few days, Henry said. Found him out back, all alone. Poor thing was half-starved and freezing. I couldn't just leave him out there. Mrs. Miller peered over the counter at the rabbit, her face softening into a smile. Well, aren't you just the kindest soul, Henry? Taking in a little orphan like that. You've always had a soft spot for the creatures of the world, haven't you? Henry chuckled and shrugged. I suppose so. He's been a good little helper, too. Keeps me company in the early mornings. Word spread quickly through the village about Henry's new companion, and soon people were coming to the bakery not just for the bread, but to catch a glimpse of the little rabbit who had taken up residence there. Children especially were enchanted by the tiny creature, and Henry would often catch them sneaking little treats to the rabbit when they thought he wasn't looking. As the days turned into weeks, Henry began to notice that the rabbit seemed to be growing more attached to him. It would follow him around the bakery, hopping along behind him as he moved from the oven to the counter, or sitting quietly by his feet as he kneaded dough. Henry hadn't planned on keeping the rabbit at first. He had figured he would care for it until it was strong enough to return to the wild. But as time passed, it became clear that the rabbit had no intention of leaving. One evening, as Henry sat by the fire after a long day, the little rabbit hopped onto his lap, nuzzling its head against his chest. Henry smiled, stroking the rabbit's soft fur. Well, I suppose you've decided to stay, haven't you? He said softly. The rabbit twitched its ears as if in response, and Henry chuckled. All right then. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. And so, the rabbit became a permanent resident of the Cozy Crust. Henry named him Thistle, after the wildflowers that grew in the meadows outside the village. Thistle became something of a mascot for the bakery, and the villagers came to love him almost as much as they loved Henry's bread. Children would bring him treats, and Thistle would happily sit by the hearth, watching the hustle and bustle of the bakery with quiet curiosity. Life in Oak Hollow continued much as it always had, with the gentle rhythm of the seasons and the daily routine of village life. But for Henry, something had changed. Thistle's presence brought a new sense of joy and companionship to his days, filling the quiet hours of the early morning with warmth and life. One particularly chilly autumn morning, as Henry opened the bakery for the day, he noticed something strange. There, at the front door of the Cozy Crust, was a small crowd of people. They were gathered around, whispering and pointing at something on the ground. Frowning, Henry walked over to see what had caught their attention. To his surprise, there was a second rabbit sitting on the doorstep, shivering in the cold. It looked just as thin and frightened as Thistle had when Henry had found him months ago. Henry bent down to scoop up the rabbit, just as he had with Thistle, and carried it inside. Thistle, who had been nibbling on a bit of lettuce near the counter, immediately hopped over to inspect the newcomer. To Henry's amazement, the two rabbits seemed to recognize each other. They sniffed at each other for a moment, then Thistle nudged the new rabbit gently with his nose, as if to say, "It's all right, you're safe here." Henry smiled, watching the interaction. "Well, it looks like we've got another guest," he said. "Don't worry, little one. You're in good hands now." The villagers were amazed at the sight of not one, but two rabbits living at the Cozy Crust. The second rabbit, who Henry named Clover, quickly settled into life at the bakery, just as Thistle had. The two rabbits became inseparable, hopping around the bakery together and keeping Henry company through the long hours of baking.